Moving on to the next question now. It's actually a series of questions under the topic of the protection of heritage places. Questions were drawn from questions suggested by Rowena Dunk, Philip Winter, Debbie Williams and Janet Scott. Attention has been drawn in recent days to a number of significant heritage buildings in the city that are at risk of being lost due to demolition or neglect. First question, what would you do to prevent private owners of heritage properties sitting on them, doing nothing with them and letting them effectively and potentially be demolished by neglect? And I've got a couple of examples there to make the point. Bell's Plumber Shop and Edmund Wright House. Perhaps if I can just have a quick answer on that one first, and then I'll come back to supplementary or subsequent questions. What would you do?
Thank you, Christine. One thing that I already have done is introduced into Parliament the Heritage Preservation Measures Bill, and this is to protect state heritage listed buildings from demolition. And this sort of came out of our Save the Gatehouse, a campaign that would not allow the demolition of state heritage listed buildings without the consent of both houses of Parliament. So that's something that I've already done. I've introduced that legislation. It is much more difficult, of course, for private holdings, for especially buildings that aren't state heritage listed. But I think one thing we need to have is a much better conversation about the importance of heritage and why we must continue to preserve it and have that become part of our general ethos as a community.
Thank you. Frank Pangallo, what would you do?
Thank you, Chair. Well, I would expect and ask the government to intervene and try and save these buildings, and also impose conditions on the owners when they buy heritage buildings that they must maintain them to a certain standard. The example you gave us also of the Bell's plumbing shop there on Paynham Road, it's just quite unfortunate that despite the fact there's been so much litigation over that, it still remains something of an eyesore, and there needs to be appropriate legislation to ensure that that building is going to be saved. There's no point just leaving it there, waiting for some person to dig into their own pockets and spend the money. The government needs to take the initiative. So really the pressure should be on governments to ensure more protection for these buildings and, if need be, intervention.
Thank you. The Honourable Susan Close. What would you do?
I think there is a complexity here that's worth understanding. What we don't want to do is create a disincentive for private investment in heritage buildings. We can't have the state owning every single heritage item. So it must be possible for private owners to buy, and we don't want to make it a disincentive to buy them, nor do we want to create an incentive to let them run down and therefore the government steps in and fixes them up. So my view is that with the particular landmark ones that we're talking about, one of which I think had a 99-year lease granted by the Liberal government fairly recently, Edmund Wright House, so I'm disappointed that's on your list as being neglected. I think it has to be case by case. I don't think there's a simple legislative fix, even though I'm sure that's what people want to hear. On the question of state heritage items, though, I'd like to say that the Waite Gatehouse was saved by the people of South Australia, particularly around the National Trust. It would have been the first state heritage place to be demolished and was proposed to be done so by the government and was saved by the people, and you should be so proud of yourselves. What we will do in government is change the legislation so if there were to be such a proposal in the future, and Labor has absolutely no intention of knocking over any state heritage place, but in order to change the rules for the future, we would ensure that there'd be required public consultation on that, which didn't occur, and that there would be, the State Heritage Council would be able to make a report on the impact, and that would be public, because the State Heritage Council was completely locked out of the question of the gatehouse. So that's our policy, and that's unfortunately the complexity of private ownership of heritage places.
Yes, you do bring out the complexities there. The Honourable Robert Sims.
Thank you. Look, I agree a lot that Frank and Sam have said. I think really what we need to be doing is providing disincentives for owners of these buildings to let them sit there idle. I'd like to see landowners who let these buildings fall into disrepair face fines. It really makes you weep when you see these beautiful buildings on North Terrace sitting there vacant in a terrible condition when we have people literally sleeping on the street. what does that say about our priorities as a state? So my view is we need to get the landowners to take some action and legislatively put in place some measures to do that. But I also think we need to stop these buildings falling into private hands to begin with. And there's something seriously wrong when we see our iconic buildings that are of value to all South Australians, being sold off to private industry. And I think we need to put a stop to that. So we need to legislate to protect those buildings and ensure that doesn't happen. And look, I certainly welcome what Susan has said around wanting to put in place some more safeguards if the Labor Party moves into government. But I'd also just highlight for everybody watching at home how important it is to have a crossbench in there as well in the next Parliament to ensure that whoever is in government, we are able to put pressure on the major parties and stand up for these heritage buildings. In the upper house, of course, for us in the Greens, that's a big focus.
Well said, Rob, well said.
Thank you. No point. He's got a plug in there, hasn't he?
Look,
well, I am a politician. I can't help myself.
Hold on, Susan Close, it looks like it's 3 against 1 here. But look, can I, taking up...
I don't think we actually disagree. I think it's a question of emphasis and subtlety. I think we're all pretty much on the same ticket.
Yes, it does sound like that. Picking up your point, Robert Sims, you say, well, I think I understood you to say state heritage places should not be in private hands. Now...
And no, just to be clear, I didn't say all state heritage places shouldn't be in private hands, because I recognise there is private ownership of, heritage homes and so on. The point I was making was around those that are particularly iconic, and, some of the examples, places like Martindale Hall and Edmund Wright House, those that occupy a really unique position in our cultural heritage. And that's something I think you could look at through legislation.
All right. Well, look, just picking up the point that it's probably unlikely that all state heritage places would be in public hands. Should every state heritage place, whether government owned or privately owned, be required to have a management plan that addresses protection, preservation and enhancement, and that the implementation of that plan is monitored and supported with public investment? Just starting with you, Robert, what would you say to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's really important. It's disappointing that the Minister's not here tonight, because there was a very good article recently in the Advertiser that went through a series of buildings that have fallen into disrepair, like Edmund Wright House. And the Minister's response was, there's a management plan in place. Well, if that's the case, it's a toothless tiger, and I think it should be a focus for the new Parliament to make sure that we have some management plans with real teeth, and that have consequences for landowners that don't do the right thing and let these buildings fall into disrepair. But also, as I said before, I think there needs to be a question around what do we do with these key iconic buildings like Martindale Hall and others that are of such significance to South Australians that we shouldn't allow them to fall into the hands of private owners.
Okay. For the moment, I'm just going to stick with whether each state heritage place should have a management plan. So thanks for that. Susan Close.
Yes, ideally, I think they should, although I just want to be careful because Port Adelaide is a state heritage area, which means that every place within those few streets that are designated are in fact treated as state heritage places. So we just need to be careful about our definitions. There's lots of private ownership of homes, and I think it would be onerous for each of those to have a management plan. But I think if what we're actually talking about are the iconic individual buildings that have individually received state heritage status, then indeed it is much simpler to talk about the need for them primarily to be in public hands, ideally, but not always, and that they have a proper management plan that is kept to.
And that is monitored and enforced?
Exactly. And that's what we all want. We just need to be careful about not creating an impossibility for private people to invest in state heritage places. And so perhaps it's a subtlety and changes in the legislation so that we don't incidentally catch those places up.
Delicate balance. Thank you. Sam DeLuc.
Thank you. I think prima facie, absolutely. But I think Susan raises some very valid points about practicality of implementing such a thing. And perhaps, and I think all 139 attendees would all agree that we need stronger heritage protection laws. But in doing that and in creating stronger heritage protection law, perhaps there's a chance to revisit that criteria to become a state heritage listed building as well. And if we are going to look at having legislation with teeth and enforcement and better plans, then maybe we also need to relook at the register and see what is actually attainable and what is achievable in protecting those things that need the most protection. And as I said before, it's also about changing the culture of our community, the attitude of government, Department of Infrastructure, especially of developers, of landowners, on how we interact with heritage.
Thanks, Sam. Frank Pengello.
Thank you, Chair. Look, we need to be careful in relation to that proposal. Yes, I agree, but I think within reason. We need to be careful because to do that could impose financial disadvantage to those private owners who may not be able to maintain them to the standard that would be required. So in that regard, that's where the government can step in and provide a number of incentives themselves. Or even local government can also kick in with some kind of funding or subsidy that is provided to them to ensure that they are kept up. Because the last thing we want to see are private owners being pushed to bankruptcy because there's state heritage requirement to ensure them to keep up to a certain standard. The other thing we need to be also mindful of is retrospectivity. Now, you may have noticed that story in the paper today in relation to the former home of the Wright brothers at Gilberton, where it was bought by an individual for a considerable amount of money, over $2 million. And Mark Hamilton from the Adelaide City Council, or a councillor, was saying that perhaps it should be bought or money should be put into it to retain the building rather than have it demolished. Now, that again is creating a disadvantage to the owner who bought it in good faith. He was going to rebuild the place in probably the same style that it was. But however, I think we need to be careful that we don't disadvantage owners in doing that. But nonetheless, certainly there needs to be requirements to preserve these buildings, and it's incumbent on governments and also local government to also kick in.